Good morning. Welcome to the Skeptrack bright and early. I know that there were a lot of fun things going on last night, so we're grateful that you're here today. With us this morning is Stephen Novella, who is widely known and well known in the skeptic universe as the skeptic's guide to the universe, etc. I'm Angie Mattke. I'm an emergency physician in practice and the assistant director of the Skeptrack. So this morning we were going to talk about some medical nonsense. Now, some of this information, of course, is well known to a lot of skeptics, and we're hoping to add some more recent information and talk about some of the evolution of some of the laws and things like that. So. First, this is a conflict of interest statement. We are tools of the medical industrial complex, okay? I personally am board certified in emergency medicine. Steve is...
I'm board certified in three things, actually, in adult neurology, headache medicine, and neuromuscular medicine.
We're both human, and so mistakes sometimes will creep in. And I stole a lot of these images from the internet, so... The main categories that you'll see of woo and things like that are the alternatives type systems like homeopathy, Ayurvedic, excuse me, traditional Chinese medicine. You'll see more biological-based things like vitamins, herbs, foods, dietary supplements, energy-type things, mind-body things, manipulative-type things, and I guess more ways than one. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are sort of the big, broad categories that the things fall into. So we're going to define some terms. First is evidence. So we need to define what evidence actually is. So first, things need to be scientifically plausible. They should not violate rules of physics. They should be reproducible, and they should be falsifiable.
So if you could pause on that slide for a second, I do like to point out that the first 2 points there are not part of evidence-based medicine. One of the most, so I'm the editor of Science-Based Medicine, and what is science-based medicine? Why does it exist? It exists because evidence-based medicine does not consider those first two job points. It was designed to consider clinical evidence only. And the reason for that was actually semi-legitimate at the time. Like in the 1980s, the EBM emerged out of this concern that physicians weren't using the best clinical evidence available in their clinical decision-making, right, at the point of patient care. So they said we need to do two things. We need to establish standards of clinical evidence, and we need to make sure that physicians have access to that evidence when they're making their medical decisions. So it's really the two pillars of EBM. And they specifically did not want doctors doing things because they made sense without the evidence, because lots of things that make sense aren't true and they don't work. So it's like, this should work. It's like, okay, that's good, but it's not enough. And because if you study it, most things that should work don't. But what they inadvertently did by eliminating the plausibility from the equation is they also gave an unfair advantage to things which were implausible. And it didn't occur to them. And why would it really occur to them? Well, because they were concerned about not relying on plausibility. They didn't even consider that people would be promoting medical treatments that were extremely implausible or that, violated the laws of physics. That wasn't on their radar in the 1980s. So while they were leveling the playing field, they actually, not wanting to give an unfair advantage to things that were plausible but lacked evidence, they simultaneously took away the disadvantage of things that were implausible. Now, the alternative medicine movement loved that, because if you factor plausibility out of the equation and your therapy is highly implausible, that was Christmas to any alternative medicine proponent, and they got very good at claiming to be practicing like evidence-based alternative medicine, which is an oxymoron, but that's that became the thing then, and it gave this false stamp of legitimacy to a whole swath of complete nonsense that was with extreme, even basic physics implausibility under EBM. So that's why, my colleagues and I are like, okay, this has to change. That's not working. So we created science-based medicine to put back plausibility and, like not violating the laws of physics into the equation. And since we did that, actually, so this emerged, probably 10, 15 years ago. Since we did that, there's been a lot of research reinforcing in like really rigorous statistical, ways why that's actually vital. It's because you can't actually interpret the clinical evidence not in the context of the prior plausibility. So we're assuming that you guys know all the basic stuff, like that homeopathy is bullshit, right? We don't need to explain that to you. So we're going to try to get a little bit more sophisticated and give you sort of maybe a little bit of a richer understanding of why it's bullshit. But what's interesting is like if you have a clinical study or a series of clinical studies with statistical evidence on does the treatment work or not work, it might seem as if that's all you need to know whether or not the treatment works, but it really statistically isn't. You have to know what the prior probability is before you can even statistically interpret the evidence. And so for that reason, there is this push among statisticians, amongst researchers, among those researchers who do things like look at the medical literature and try to answer that question, how do we know what works and what doesn't work from the research? Away from the frequentist approach to statistics, which is the p-value, which is basically saying, what's the probability of this evidence given the null effect, right? So if there's no effect here, what's the probability that we would see these results in the study? Towards a more Bayesian approach, which is what's the prior probability, what's the new evidence, now what's the post probability, right? So the entire way we approach scientific evidence is slowly shifting away from evidence-based medicine towards science-based medicine. And this is independent of those of us who are promoting science-based medicine. It's happening among statisticians. They're like, everyone's doing it wrong. The EBM was like rocket fuel to it was already happening. People were like over-relying on the p-value and were not doing proper statistical analysis. And the statisticians are now starting to push back. But they're basically saying the same exact things we are, but coming at it from a completely different angle. They're coming at it from a purely statistical, mathematical approach. We're coming at it from we got to get all the woo out of medicine approach. And we arrived in the middle of, Bayesian analysis is the way to go. Prior probability has to be part of the equation. You can't really even understand the clinical evidence statistically unless you think about things like, are we violating the laws of physics here? So that's like in the last 10 years this has all happened, and it's been great. Because we have all of this literature support for what we've been saying all along. So the statisticians get it. They know that we have to do this. EBM has to evolve into science-based medicine, and it's really the only way to police out all of the complete pseudoscience that is steadily infiltrating medicine.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So given that, there are different levels of evidence, and they range from systematic review to expert opinion, and this does not include anecdote. So you want to comment on that?
Well, so anecdotes are uncontrolled observations, right? And anecdote is at the bottom, the very, very bottom of the evidence pyramid, but you cannot use anecdote to test a hypothesis. You can't use it to answer the question, does this treatment work? Is this phenomenon real? Because you're not controlling for all of the variables. And when you're dealing with 7.5 billion biological systems, the variability and the confounding factors are massive. Plus, we have horrible memories, we have horrible perception, we have subjective biases. So anecdotes are noise. It's just massive noise. But you can use anecdotes to generate hypotheses. Like, oh, okay, I've seen a few patients where this has happened. I wonder if that's a real thing or not. But then you have to do actual scientific evidence to see if it's real. You can't just stop at the anecdote. The difference is the alternative medicine proponents, they're happy to stop at the anecdotes, right? So they're practicing based on noise without ever filtering out what's signal and what's noise. But so some people say, well, anecdotes it's still evidence. Like, yeah, but it's way at the bottom. It's really just generating new possibilities. It's not really answering any questions.
And if you don't have a systematic approach, how can you tell? In fact, one of the things I mentioned to Steve the other day was when he gave a talk on brain failures, I think it was called, and it talked about, our perceptions and our memories are terrible. He mentioned it just now. And people will say, well, I know what I saw. No, you don't.
Or I clearly remember. No,
you really don't.
No, you don't.
So, in 1992, Congress actually created the Office of Alternative Medicine. It was based on legislation sponsored by Iowa politicians. A lot of trouble is coming out of Iowa these days. Tom Harkin and Berkeley Bedell, or Bedell, I don't know how to say his name. But anyway, so the mission was to explore complementary and alternative healing practices in the context of rigorous science. So Senator Harkin apparently believed that bee pollen had cured his hay fever, and Representative Bedell had reportedly thought that cow colostrum had cured his Lyme disease. So they hoped that this organization would prove that these alternative therapies, like theirs, would be brought into the mainstream, and they reflected the popular culture at the time, in particular, because about 50% of U.S. residents use some sort of alternative medicine, and about 10% use it for their children.
All right, those figures are really complicated, though, because I've done a deep dive on it, and I update that on the Science-Based Medicine website. So that the figures were like 50, 60, 70%. That's only if you include like everyone taking vitamins and everyone who's ever gone for a massage, or the sort of very, very low level manipulative kind of therapy stuff. Or sometimes like early on they would include prayer. Like if you've ever prayed for the health of a loved one, that's using alternative medicine. And so the numbers get massively inflated. And I think we have to avoid falling into that pitfall, because the other side does say, see, we're popular. And we use it to say, see, it's a big problem that we got to fix. But if you really do a deep dive on the numbers, if you look at like, well, how many people are using energy medicine, like real hard and fast alternative medicine, it's in the low single digits. And if you look at all of the hardcore, like homeopathy, acupuncture, energy medicine, those kind of things, Reiki, it only gets up to like maybe 10 to 15% are using something like that. You only get into the big numbers when you add chiropractic, because that's then it's like 20, 30%. Then you get big numbers. But most of what chiropractors do, like 80% of what they're doing, is just physical therapy, really, at the end of the day. So again, it's really, and this gets to a deeper problem, is that the category of alternative medicine is fake. It doesn't really mean anything. It's an umbrella, category for anything we want to include in there for marketing purposes. And it exists to create a double standard, to say, well, we're not going to follow the normal rules of evidence. We may pretend to, but we're not going to. And in fact, there's even legislation in many states, 20 or so states, that says that if you're practicing alternative medicine, you can't be held to a standard of care. Are you aware? You're aware of that. Mm-hmm. You guys are aware of that? So you're protected from malpractice by a standard of care. And what's the standard of care? That's complicated, and it's all state by state. But it's basically the community of medical professionals establish a standard of care based upon scientific evidence, and often established by expert review and et cetera. Like there's different ways that you could say this is what the standard is. It only really ever becomes an issue if you're in a court of law and you're either defending your license or there's a malpractice suit, and knowing what the standard of care is critically important. But there are now a number of states, and this is increasing all the time, that say, okay, but if you're practicing alternative medicine, which they don't define, then the state cannot hold you to any standard of care. That's literally what they're called healthcare freedom laws. But what their freedom to practice quackery. They're the freedom for the practitioner from a standard of care, but they're sold as freedom for the patients to get whatever health care they want. But that's not really what the purpose of the laws are. So, that is what we're up against, right? And part of how they get those laws through the legislatures by saying, well, look how popular it is. Everybody wants this, right? So they say, okay, sure, if people want alternative medicine, we'll let them have it. But it's all ultimately, at the end of the day, erasing the scientific evidence as a basis of healthcare.
And one of the more shocking things that I found is that CMS is paying for it.
Yeah.
It's shocking. They are paying for, I was going to save this for later, but it's relevant. So, but they're paying, they actually have a definition, not a definition, it's a non-definition, really. Any other healthcare provider, but it specifically includes acupuncture, chiropractic, I think aromatherapy is included. I'm not sure. I have the text on another thing, but it's paying for it. This is your tax dollars paying for this nonsense. And I saw a recent article where their chiropractors even making a bigger push to be included as primary care physicians.
Yeah. So they're lobbying first for licensure, right? Then they lobby to expand their scope of practice, to prescribe drugs, to do surgery, to be primary care providers. This is naturopaths as well as chiropractors, homeopaths, acupuncture. They're all just constantly trying to expand their scope of practice. Then they get laws put in place that say that they can't be held to a scientific standard of care, and then they get laws put in place to say that insurance companies have to reimburse for their services. And then basically they're doctors without really any medical training, without the proper expertise, without really being plugged into the entire healthcare system the way that physicians are, and without legitimacy, practicing abject quackery. But that is the system that we have right now, and it's sort of slowly creeping forward state by state. And of course, whenever any federal laws, like when the Affordable Care Act came up, they're right there saying, okay, ACA's got to cover alternative medicine too. So, and this is their livelihood, so they're relentless at lobbying
and they've
every
got
step
one
of the way.
issue. They have one issue, and they can channel those funds right to the legislatures, where they can. I was just telling Steve about. I'm bringing up the things that we were going to bring up this afternoon, and we'll probably mention them again. No, it's okay. So some of the same things are happening with other scope of practice with other professions. So optometry, for example, they're wonderful. I have an optometrist that I go to for my glasses and contacts, but in many places they want to actually have the ability to do surgery. I got a big problem with that. And so they, in Kentucky a few years ago, there was a bill that dropped. Now, they have been greasing this legislature with PAC money for years ahead of time. Physicians are not always aware of how important it is to be engaged at a legislature level, and how important the laws are, because they're busy trying to take care of patients and do a lot of other things.
It's worse than that. But that in the 1980s, a group of chiropractors sued the AMA for restraint of trade. And the AMA lost. It was a very narrow decision. They didn't say that chiropractors are legitimate. They couldn't say that they couldn't criticize chiropractors. They basically said, well, you're one trade organization. The chiropractors are a different trade organization, and you can't basically tell your members that you can't do business with this other trade organization. So it was a very limited legal decision, but the AMA, from that point forward, decided, okay, well, we're just not going to do this anymore. So there essentially is no pushback against all of this from physicians. So that's partly why this is
partly why, but this isn't even woo. I mean, these are optometrists that actually have some skills that are valuable. I mean, we need people to do that kind of thing, but they shouldn't ought to be doing surgery. And so, there was a bill that dropped. It literally drops, like they have a slot that they put the bill in, and it drops on a Sunday night. And the Kentucky is well named because it greased through like KY, and they waived the reading. They waived the reading of the bill in the House, and then they, by the time anybody in the PAC for the ophthalmologists got wind of it, it had already passed through. They had waived the reading of the bill. It had already been passed by the legislature and the representatives. And then by the time it came to the Senate, the ophthalmologists couldn't get their act together fast enough to call their folks that they have a relationship with. And the governor signed it by Friday. 5 days this bill took. Now optometrists can do surgery. Do not get your eyes taken care of in Kentucky by an optometrist, please. We're already seeing complications. I have friends in emergency medicine up in Kentucky, and they're seeing complications. And there's no real recourse, because it's hard to undo that.
And that's the dead of night approach that is very, very common. Mm-hmm. They definitely want to do this under the radar in the dead of night without public, discussion, or because they're afraid, of what will come to light. But again, we don't have
number two.
We don't have the infrastructure to keep track of every possible. We actually try. We do, like on science-based medicine, we track legislative bills that are pushing this, and we try to at least alert people and say, hey, they're trying to pass an anti-vaccine bill in your state, or they're trying to get expanded scope of practice for naturopaths over here, and it's like dozens and dozens a year. And we win a lot of those cases, but then they just bring it up the next year.
Yep,
it's like
every year.
They only have to win once. We have to win every year on every issue in every state.
Right.
So they're just slowly ratcheting up their scope of practice.
And they have the one issue. So if they're greasing with PAC money, then that's the only issue they have that year, and the next year, and the next year, and the next year.
For them, it's an investment, right? But for us, it's just down the black hole, right? We don't get anything out of it except protecting our patients.
Right. And so, but we also have multiple. We're fighting battles on multiple fronts. We're trying to protect patients from the nonsense on one angle. We're trying to, I don't even know how to call it, we're woo on one side from folks who want to practice medicine without a license or without the training. And I mean, they may have a license, but it's not the right kind of license. We're trying to protect people because that's where the funds are, and we want to make sure that people don't get taken advantage of. So. Anyway, okay, so caveats to the literature. So there are publication biases. More positive studies are published, and refutation studies are rarely published. Overwhelmingly, if a study is funded by pharmaceutical companies, the studies will support the drug. Y'all know these things. It depends on the type of study, as Steve's mentioned already. There is error that's intrinsic to these things, and of course, journalistic integrity. I mean, if you've got a axe to grind or a Wakefield to skewer, I don't know how to say that, but I mean, if you have an agenda, then you can tweak things.
Right. I mean, none of that means that the medical literature isn't legitimate and valid. It is. It just takes a lot longer to prove something than people think, right? You can't know anything from a single study or even a few studies. It takes 10, 20 years to really grind any significant question through the clinical literature. But what it does mean is that if you want to prove any position, you can cherry pick the literature and prove that position, and you could make it seem, superficially compelling, unless you have the expertise to do a real review of the literature and know where the evidence stands.
So Dr. Google's not? Yeah,
so that's the point. It's this noise thing, and so you have journalists who like, a study showed X, so I guess X is legitimate, and then you have advocacy groups or woo practitioners who could cite, cherry pick the basic science or whatever to try to make it seem like it supports their position. And we're dealing this something else we have to deal with all the time is a study comes out that shows something like, does fluoride cause reduce IQ? This is like the latest thing to come out. It's like, well, no. You have to look at all the literature. You have to look at that individual study. There was a lot of flaws in that study, and it didn't really show what the press is saying that it showed. But it takes a long time to deconstruct a complex study and put it in the context of a complex literature, and that's not what journalists do. They go for the flashy headline. And if you're Mike Adams, or the health ranger, if you're somebody like that, you can list studies all day long that will show whatever you want to show, because that's the noise in the literature. But you can't go too far and say, well, we don't know anything, or the science says that, even doctors don't know what they're doing. No, it just takes a long time and a lot of research and an unbiased, fair, critical, skeptical look at the literature to really know, what's real, what's not real, what works, what doesn't work, and that's a little bit too much for the social media news cycle, but that's what we're dealing with.
It takes time to look into the registration, study registrations, to see how many of these studies were registered versus how many of those were published, because you can bet that there's going to be a file drawer effect where people who didn't get the results they were hoping for will shove that study in a drawer and never publish.
So now you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is great. So a lot of human clinical trials are being pre-registered, and there's two advantages to that. One is you can't hide it if the results aren't what you wanted. And two, if you pre-publish your protocol, your methods, which is increasing, there's pressure to do this, it makes it harder to cheat at the back end. And most of the cheating is inadvertent. It's what we call p-hacking. In other words, if you sort of shift your methods while you're doing the research, you can manufacture a positive outcome, and a lot of researchers do this without realizing they're doing it. But if you say, all right, these are my methods, and they has to include things, I'm going to look at 150 patients, no more, no less. I'm going to look at these outcomes. I'm going to do this statistical analysis, and this is my threshold for being positive. Unless you say all those things ahead of time, if you can make those decisions as you go along, you can, inadvertently sort of p-hack your way to a false positive result. And there's a ton of that in the literature as well. That's why replications are so important, because you can't do that if you're doing an exact replication. So the pre-publication is great. But again, journalists aren't going to go to clinicaltrials.gov and say, well, how many of these studies have been pre-published? Have been sort of pre-registered. And, this study was registered 8 years ago, but hasn't published yet. So that's a long time. Why is that? Would a journalist know that that's a long time? Or how long does it take from registration to there's something published in the literature? How long were they collecting data for? How long should it take to do their analysis? And if you see a lot of this, why are all these unpublished data, that was registered? But there's one study that is questionable and positive gets published right away. That's pretty good evidence that there's a file drawer effect going on. You can also do a funnel plot statistical analysis to show you that the evidence should follow a statistical pattern. If it works or doesn't work, it all should flow. Follow some sort of bell curve. And if it's all distorted towards the positive end, you could see by recrunching the numbers. There's publication bias right there in the numbers. You could see it. How many people know to look for that? Did they do a multiple analysis? Did they look at 10 outcomes and only publish the one positive outcome? There's so many different ways, man, you could squirrel the literature, and you have to know all of them. But the good thing is, when these studies get published, they go through the meat grinder. There's the pre-publication peer review, then there's the post-publication peer review. And sometimes, this is a positive thing about social media and the internet. When the fluoride study came out, I was able to, here's a site that has 20 different experts in this narrow field, looking over this study and criticizing it in excruciating detail. So that information's available too. But you have to be able to go through that, But then, there are people like us who could then can do that, could sort of put that together for the public, and that's what we do on science-based medicine. So that's there as a resource, but again, that's a lot of stuff to do that for. So it's not, I can't always get to everything.
Yeah, and I don't know about your residency program. Mine, we had journal club, but it was ostensibly to teach you how to read a study, but it was once a month. And it was not fun, and it was grind, and it was in the middle of residency when nobody was sleeping, and it was hard to process information. So I don't know if your residency was similar.
Well, my residency was, but my current residents, because I'm in a teaching hospital, get more than that because I'm there.
Well, because you're there, sure.
So I make sure that they get this lecture at some point during their residency, but. but that's all haphazard. It's not systematic. So you could get through. It depends on where you go to school, who your mentors were. You could get through the whole process and not have any idea how to interpret a study.
Agreed. So one of the other things is that there are a lot of what so-called predatory journals,
yes,
where you pay to play, you pay to publish, and it doesn't matter how good or bad that study is. The peer review can be completely nothing.
Non-existent, yeah.
Yeah. So, who was it? A physics?
Yes.
Can you talk about that? Because that was an amazing story.
There was I forget his name, but a physicist did it. Well, there was a couple. There was Sokol. That was different. That was not the medical literature. But then there was a sting operation on these predatory journals, on so-called open access. And there's no problem. I'm a big fan of open access. Many of them are legitimate. But the open access format, which is, all right, we're not going to charge for access to the content so that anybody in the public can have access to this published study. But we need to pay for it somehow. So we'll just charge the scientists a publication fee to pay for the journal, and then we'll make the data openly available. All right, that's fine. As opposed to you have to pay for a subscription to the journal, and that's how they make their money. So this is just a different business model, and it's great, except for the fact that it created the possibility that you can just publish a whole bunch of crap journals, publish any kind of crap, and just charge researchers on the fringe who can't get their studies into a more prestigious journal $200 or $400 or $500 to publish their crap in your crap journal, and you're not going to bother to you pay a lot of editors, or so you have one editor monitoring 20 of these journals. And it's all digital publishing. You don't have to crank out a print journal. So it created this business model where for very little infrastructure overhead, you can crank out a lot of digital open access crap journals publishing crappy studies. And some of them became, beyond that, they became predatory, meaning that they are soliciting our articles from publishers, from researchers. And they're also, and I get these emails every day. If you have an academic email address, this is the spam. This is what you get as a professor. This is your spam.
I'm getting all the penis enlargement ones.
Yeah. So what you get is the email saying, "How would you like to be an editor of this journal?" Where it's basically, so if you're a young academic, like at the beginning of your career, and you want to flesh out your CV, you want to put things on your resume, basically, and say, "Oh, I could be an editor on this open access journal." But if they're just trying to get you, they want your institution's name on their journal to give it a patina of legitimacy, and that's it. So there can be kind of a symbiotic relationship there. And of course, if you're a young researcher and you can't get your study published in a prestigious journal, you could publish it there as well. So there's an ecosystem for this, and that just is generating countless, worthless studies. And what the sting operation was, they basically created a fake study that they made as bad as they possibly could. They went out of their way to deliberately make it like a fatally flawed study. They did everything wrong. They were creative in how wrong they could make the study. And then the authors didn't exist. Their university didn't exist. So any even basic vetting would have shown that this was a completely fabricated and fraudulent study. And then they sent it to hundreds of open access journals, and something like 60% published it without review. The PLOS journals, which are sort of the flagship ones, they didn't publish it, so they picked up on it, and so all the good ones didn't publish it, but a lot of, more than half, published, which showing that they have zero editorial or peer review process. Basically exposed that. But this is not to say that the traditional journals don't have their problems. They just have a different set of problems, because they survive by subscriptions. And how do you get subscriptions? By having prestige. And how do you get prestige? By impact factor. What's impact factor? That means people are citing your study. Other studies are citing your studies. How do you get other studies to cite your studies? You publish new and exciting research. So they are biased towards publishing studies that show something new and exciting, or that are against what we already think. But those are also the most likely studies to be wrong and to in fact be retracted or to be reversed on later research. So the high-impact traditional journals have a huge turnover of the studies that they publish may be exciting and interesting, and they get the press release, and therefore people know about them and they cite them, but they're also the most likely to not ultimately be true, which is also a problem, but just a completely different problem than the predatory journals. So we basically have to fix this problem at both ends, and they require entirely different sets of fixes. And we're working on it, academia is working on it, but we haven't fixed the problem yet. And all of that just generates more noise that we have to deal with, and more noise that the less than scientific practitioners can exploit to support, again, whatever conclusion they want to support.
And they can even quote that original study without the follow-up refutation or the retraction, like the Wakefield thing, or
the Seralini studies, like the Seralini saying GMOs cause cancer, retracted, but people are still citing it, even though it was a retracted study.
And they also don't generally publish confirmation studies, and so, because they're very difficult to confirm.
Replications. Yeah, so the replications, when somebody says, I'm going to just redo that same study just to see if I get the same results, it's critical for science. And there are some journals that just won't publish exact replications because it doesn't give them impact factor, because it's boring. It's been done already. So that's something that's a priority thing that needs to change among the highest impact journals. And there's no excuse now, because now you could just publish online. It's that they can't say we don't have the pages for it. It's like, put it online. You don't have to put it in your print journal.
That's right. Do you want to go on to placebo, or you want to take some questions? Okay.
Maybe do the placebo and then we'll take questions.
Okay. All right. So there may be a real placebo effect, but it's one of those things that we just sort of have to say, well, what we're trying to do is to decide, is this thing actually better than a placebo? So if you want to sleep, it's hard to tell, did you get to sleep because of the medicine, or did you get to sleep because you felt more relaxed that you got the medicine and you slept? So that's one of those things, or did you feel calmer? So those are the sort of subjective things that makes it very difficult to tease out what is a real effect. So, and this is very difficult to separate from bias. And it does depend on your patient's expectations, but the expectations are not always the ones that you think they are. I mean, yes, of course, the color of the pill seems to matter, how people respond to the placebo, is there an X or a Z in the name? But what about the plants in the doctor's office? I mean, if they're dead, you have a different expectation of that physician than someone whose plants are alive and thriving. So
it's also culturally different. Like in Asia, they have a bigger placebo effect from needles, because that's just part of their culture. The more you invest in it, the more of a placebo effect there is, the more the risk, the more of a placebo effect there is, the more invasive, the more of a placebo effect there is. Just because that all sets, if this is a really expensive, complicated, invasive, risky procedure, it really must work, right? There's that assumption. There's many, many sources of placebo effects. There is no one placebo effect. When we refer to the placebo effect, we're talking statistically. It means that it's everything other than a real response to a physiologically active intervention. It's everything else, which is partly bias, it's partly illusion, it's partly statistical, like regression to the mean. You take a treatment when you're feeling bad, when you're feeling at your worst. You're going to almost by definition not be at your worst after being at your worst. You regress to the mean. Also, you might be doing multiple treatments. So how do you know which one is actually having the effect? There's all sorts of things. You change your behavior when you're getting treated. And then there's the subjective stuff of just you feel better because you're being treated. And there's just investment justification. You say, well, I'm doing this. What I noticed too is there's the investment justification, which is a very interesting phenomenon. If you are doing something alternative, and you're getting like squirrely looks from some people, then you want to justify the decision that you made, so you really want it to work, right? If you went to Mexico and spent $20,000 to get some snake oil injected into your ass, and people are like, why did you do that? Well, you're like, yeah, but it worked. Man, if you could say, yeah, but it worked, then that's a huge in your face to everyone who thought you were an idiot to go into Tijuana for your ass medicine. But if it didn't work, then you're a chump, right? And nobody wants to be a chump. So we have to, when we're dealing with the more unlikely it is, almost the greater the motivation to convince yourself that it actually did something. It's so sad. I mean, I've had so many patients sitting in front of me, and these are real. I'm not lying about the ass medicine. it's so sad when there's a patient sitting in front of me and it's like, by objective neurological exam, they've had zero effect from whatever it is that they did. And it's like painfully obvious. And they've convinced themselves that there's some benefit. And like, well, I'm drooling less. Okay, I mean, I'm happy for you that you think that you're drooling less, but your neurological exam is actually worse than it was, previously, objectively, by every objective measure. But it's like they have to convince themselves that it worked. And the con artists also count on that, because you're not going to go after a con artist unless you admit that you were conned. And nobody wants to do that. So it's remarkably hard to find people who are willing to say, that quack conned me, because they don't want to see themselves as the victim. But of course, as we know, Nygaard gives on the psychic end of it, that you shouldn't blame the victim. And victims shouldn't blame themselves. Anybody can be fooled, and patients are desperate. They're a vulnerable population. Nobody's going to be judgmental or blame you as the victim. It's the practitioner, the charlatan who exploited you. They're the perpetrator here. But that psychology is very, very common, and they actually count on that psychology to protect themselves.
And I don't know about you. I mean, so you have more of an office-based practice, and mine is more episodic because I see folks in the emergency department, and they'll come in and they say, I did all these things, but I don't want drugs. I'm like, well, that's what I've got. So, I want to help you, but if you don't want the only thing I have to offer, then.
Or do you have anything natural?
Yeah.
It's like, well.
Extractive willow bark.
Yeah. What do you? So then you have to deal with that whole thing. Like, that doesn't really mean anything. But you have to deal with a lot of. They've been programmed, right? They've been marketed to think that chemicals are bad, natural is good, and whatever, or like you shouldn't treat ADD with medicine because it's whatever. There's some stigma.
Well, how else are you going to get emergency physicians?
Right. So
we collectively have ADDs.
Right. There's a lot of we have to do a lot of deprogramming, sometimes just to get people to, go for we're going to do what the scientific evidence says is the best thing to do. That's how I practice. That's what I'm going to recommend to you. You can decide what you want, but I have to explain to patients sometimes, this is what I do. It's not limited to drugs. That's, we're being a little facetious there, but it's like whatever the scientific evidence says is what we'll do. And if you don't like that, then maybe I'm not the practitioner for you. That's the medicine that I practice.
And it's frustrating when even if you don't have a drug-based. I mean, I had a patient one time with severe vertigo, and I explained, listen, this is how we reposition.
Yeah.
So vertigo is a
yeah.
sensation of spinning, and it is very commonly caused by dislocation of some crystals in the inner ear. We literally have rocks in our head, and so if those get dislodged, you'll feel a sensation of movement when they're, or if you have persistent spinning, and it can be very, very troubling and disconcerting. And I'm betting somebody's had that in this room already. So one of the things you can do is to try to put those crystals back where they belong. But it is a very intense process, and it can be very miserable for the patient who has to undergo this 30 seconds of severe nausea and spinning. And so I was trying to explain to her, and I explained that whole thing about the rocks. There's a video that I showed her from an ENT, and she's like, I don't want anything natural, I want drugs. I'm like, but this is going to treat this problem, and she just was insistent. She wanted drugs. So anyway.
Okay. The drugs don't work for vertigo.
No, not well. No, they really don't.
Wish they did. But
I tried to explain that, but she just didn't want to hear it. And you have to be very careful about not making them feel bad about the choices that they've made, but just let's acknowledge that we've moved to a different area. So the other thing that is you can get negative effects, not just positive effects, and which is why I just say hypochondriacs should not get drug inserts.
Yeah. We could start lining up for questions, and while you're doing that, I'll point out, it's always a fine line, because you have to give informed consent to patients. You have to tell them what could happen, but you don't want to suggest to them like what is going to happen. You know what I mean? So there's always a fine line between informed consent and suggestibility when you have that anxious or patient, or the patient who's going to, basically whatever you tell them is going to happen, they're probably going to experience.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi. Hi, Steve. Alan Croslow. First off, I just want to ask you for a quick reference to where can you find out which articles have been retracted. Then I also want to say that if you see something, say something. I reported something to the Attorney General that got a major investigation against a stem cell firm. And my real question is, when about 10 years ago, there was an article published in either, I think it was Lancet or JAMA or one of the major journals that looked back at all their articles in the 1990s and found that almost 90% of them had new data that effectively said that that data was wrong. And so what does that say about about modern medicine?
All right. So there's 3 questions in there. I'll try to answer them all quickly. So the answer to the first question is, how do you know when articles have been retracted? There's actually a website called Retraction Watch that is a good resource to go to. And also on PubMed, if you go to the article, it should have like a watermark of retracted, over it. So it'll tell you that it's been retracted. So if you go to the article on PubMed, or if you go to Retraction Watch, you can see that it's been retracted. And then, what was the second question?
Say something, say something.
Say something. So yeah, apps, that's a really good point. And we I think as a community, this is something that we can do. And that, you know what, our counterparts in the UK are doing this, and they're getting really good results from it. And this is one thing that we're trying to do with science-based medicine, is get the community involved in this. So there are multiple ways you could report health fraud. You could report a practitioner to your state's health department. You can report a product to the FDA. You can report false claims to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And if you're not sure what to do, you could contact Science-Based Medicine, and we'll tell you what to do.
The Attorney General.
The Attorney General of your state as well. That's usually like the Department of Health and the Attorney General, for anything happening within your state, yeah. Practitioners specifically, anyone licensed, it's the Department of Health. But just if it's any business or whatever, the Attorney General is a good place to go. But you kind of have to know, do you have a good Attorney General or not? So it's very dependent on your state. But you have nothing to lose by reporting it. And even if a small percentage of what we report gets acted upon, that could have a huge effect. In terms of most published studies are wrong, which is what you're referring to, it was 60% was the figure, but it doesn't mean that most of what we're doing is wrong or most of what we think is wrong. What it means is that along the way, over that 20-year period of doing research, most of the preliminary evidence is going to be positive, whether it works or not, and most new ideas in medicine turn out to be wrong. So if you look at that preliminary phase of research, most are false positive. And that's exactly what we would predict just by the nature of medicine and medical research, and it's in fact exactly what we see. But it reinforces that you can't practice medicine based upon that preliminary evidence, because most of the time it's wrong. 60% of the time, it turns out it's not the correct answer. And then when you get to the definitive large studies down the road, it shows that it reverses what those preliminary studies showed. So it just reinforces what we're saying, but you have to interpret it properly.
Good morning. I have a doctor who I really like, but lately she's been recommending things like CoQ10 and fish oil. And I'm just wondering, how do you deal with the doctor that's starting to go down the road of woo?
So CoQ10 and fish oil, I wouldn't put them in the woo category because they're perfectly legitimate supplements. I prescribe CoQ10 for migraines because there's evidence to show that it works for migraines. And there's also...
I don't have migraines.
Yeah, so for either one, it's like, what are they giving it to you for is the question, because CoQ10 itself is perfect. And also it could be helpful for muscle cramping, especially if you're taking cholesterol lowering, some cholesterol statin drugs. They might lower your CoQ10 levels, and that causes muscle problems in the mitochondria, and so you take the CoQ10. Fine. They should, in fact, just put it in with the statin drugs. But if you're using it for something that there isn't any evidence for it, so that nutrition is in that gray zone where the nutrition, I prescribe vitamins every day in my practice. So they're perfectly legitimate. It's not that they themselves are inherently unscientific. It's that for the individual specific thing you're recommending them for, it has to be evidence and science-based. It's when you go beyond the evidence. So I have to know what what they're recommending them for to know whether or not the evidence.
Because I just turned 55.
So just there's no evidence for the routine benefit of either of those. You have to have a specific, and the fish oil though is really complicated, and the evidence has been going sort of back and forth over that line of whether or not it's worth it or not. So there's been legitimate scientific controversy over whether everyone like over 50 should be taking fish oil for their heart health. And the most recent systematic review from a few months ago said, probably not. So that's where it is now, but that's been a moving target. 6 months ago, it was probably reasonable to say, yeah, if you want to take some fish oil, go ahead. Now it's like, it's probably not going to do anything. So those are pretty much right on the line.
Okay,
Thank
you.
Sure.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. You mentioned objective measures, objective neurological measures. If there is an admitted bias, would the practitioner actually be objective in those measurements?
So, like in a clinical trial, the person who's doing those objective measurements has to be blinded, right? So in the context of a clinical trial, you have blinded evaluators, right? So that's to solve that problem. Because you're right, even objective measures have interpretation. There's interpretation for everything, unless you have a number, right? But if I'm like saying how strong is a patient, I'm feeling how strong they are, and there's a technique to that. There's a technique to that, and to also quantify if they're weak, quantifying how weak they are. And so while it's objective, there is some evaluator interpretation going on. So unless they're blinded, you can't really say that they're objective. If it's in a clinical context, not a research context, of course we're not blinded because I know everything about the patient, they're my patient. And so it's just a matter of how objective and how careful is that practitioner being and how experienced are they. But this is really built into our training because it's critical to what we do. This is what I teach my residents and my students every day, how to do an objective neurological exam, how to interpret the results appropriately, and how not to get fooled by technique or by whatever, patient effort or something else that might interfere with it. But it is very practitioner dependent. How good was their training?
And the second question was, in your science-based evidence or science-based studies, do you include retrospective studies in cases where it would be actually unethical to do a controlled group? Yeah,
so we didn't go into the detail about all the different types of science. We just said scientific evidence and anecdotal, but under scientific evidence, and I have an hour-long lecture where all I do is go over the different kinds of scientific evidence. So I'll give you the 30-second version of an hour-long lecture on that. There is observational evidence. So observational means you're not controlling for variables, you're just looking at what's happening out there in the world. So a retrospective study is going to be by definition observational because you're going back and looking at what's happened already in the past. And then there's experimental evidence where you're doing things going forward and you are doing an intervention. And then observational evidence has the advantage of you could look at thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of patients, depending on the database you have. You can't do an experiment on 1 million people, but I can go to a database and look at 1 million people and see what's happening. Experimental studies have the advantage of controlling for variables, but there's much smaller numbers. Typical study, like a pilot study, will be, we say at least 50 people in each arm, like control versus placebo versus treatment. But that's preliminary. But if it's less than 50, you don't even look at it. Definitive studies are hundreds to thousands. Some studies where there are rare events, like when you do like aspirin to prevent strokes, you need tens of thousands of patients. But those are the biggest studies that we could do. You have to do like 100 centers around the world all gathering together to recruit patients over 5 years. That's like a big, massive study. Most studies are going to be hundreds, maybe thousands, depending on how big they are. But you can control for every little detail. You blind it, everything is blinded, you're stratifying it, you're making sure that everything else is the same. The only difference is treatment versus placebo, and nobody knows who's got the treatment and who got the placebo. That's the ideal study. But there's different kinds of, like you could do cohort studies. There's different ways of doing observational studies as well. So you just have to know exactly what kind of study was it, what are the strengths and weaknesses of that kind of clinical evidence, what did the results show, and in that context, like how meaningful is it? And again, that's where you need experts to know all those things and to explain this is what this study is actually showing. Like the fluoride study I referenced, that wasn't an experimental study, that was an observational study. So now we have to consider all the confounding factors that could be in place. And what were they actually observing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where you get to like the systematic reviews, where you have experts looking at all the evidence, doing this kind of really detailed deep dive, and then synthesizing it all into, all right, this is probably what's true based upon all this evidence. Okay, sure.
Well, this is kind of coming things from the other direction, I think, in that what I'm seeing a lot in arguing against woo peddlers and especially anti-vaxxers online, what I see more and more is them co-opting the methods and language of skepticism to support, frankly, denialist positions. In fact, the most frustrating aspect is what I call placebo worship. It reminds me of Saturday Night Live sketch. If it isn't a double-blind placebo-controlled study with an absolutely salient placebo, it's crap. And it's just like I try to explain to them that saline placebo is not a magic talisman that makes the ritual called science work. But I'm wondering how you communicate, get across when the argument is coming from that direction.
Yeah. No, that's very, very true, and I run into that all the time. And so especially since we talk a lot about, well, here's the limitation in the literature, here's all the ways it could be biased, et cetera, et cetera. I've actually learned I have to incorporate towards the end of those lectures, but that doesn't mean that we don't know anything, right? It just means that the threshold of where we could say, all right, this probably is true, is a lot higher than most people think. It's actually higher than I think a lot of medical practitioners think, because they don't have the quite sophisticated enough understanding of the nuance of statistics and the literature, et cetera. And so that's also what we do with science-based medicine, is try to educate scientists and medical practitioners and academicians, like, based upon everything that we know, this is really where we should be setting the threshold, not down here. Because if we set it down here, then there's a lot of reversals. We end up saying, oh, that was wrong. We shouldn't have been doing that all along. But you're right. But the Mike Adams of the world would say, see, we don't know anything. Those doctors don't know what they're doing either. And so you might as well do what feels good, right? And we have to work against the nihilism, which is going too far. But that's an astute observation. And we just have to incorporate that into those caveats. And you might have heard me do that just during this. That doesn't mean we don't know anything. It doesn't mean that we don't get to the point where we do have a really confident conclusion. It's just that it takes a lot longer to get there than you think.
Thank you.
Sure. Jump in if you want to. I don't want to take. All right.
Hi. First off, thank you both for dedicating your lives to helping others in need.
Sure. Hey, I'm Starfleet. It's what we do.
I feel like I'm out of uniform.
We'll forgive you this time. It's Sunday. But you were talking about snake oil earlier. Would this be a form of government subsidized snake oil being sold to the general public as being okay?
Are you referring to the caffeine?
The caffeine, the sugar, not to mention the environmental impacts, things like glyphosate and just about everything made out of grain. I grew up in a time where dogs just didn't get cancer. Mm-hmm. It was just like,
they got hit by
when I first started hearing about it, I was
before.
like, your dog got cancer? And then I talked to my dad about it, and he goes like, don't worry, I remember a time when people didn't get cancer.
Yeah.
That's because they died of heart disease first.
Yeah. So.
There were a lot of deaths in accordance with that. Yeah. But could this be an amplifying effect?
So I don't think we can compare the two. And in terms of things like the cancer rates, we've been tracking those for a long time, and there isn't any mysterious increase in cancer rates. Cancer rates first of all, we've always gotten cancer. There are Egyptian mummies with cancer. This notion that cancer is a new phenomenon is completely wrong, and
just more common.
It's only more. It's exactly more common as you would predict by the aging of the population. And then the only other layer there is it becomes more common in areas where we develop new diagnostic techniques. So like when we started doing blood tests for prostate cancer, the diagnoses of prostate cancer went through the roof. And then when we said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore because we're over-diagnosing it, they plummeted. So it tracks with, are we looking for it? What's the technology for diagnosing it? And what's the age of the population? But there doesn't appear to be any other big environmental factor producing more cancer in people that beyond their age group. So that's been pretty carefully tracked.
So glycophosphate is safe?
Well, it's all about dose, right? So if the dose makes the poison.
A little bit a day, just like the
well, I mean,
water
so
pipes and
the
stuff?
question is, is it causing any problem in the doses that people are getting it? And there are systems in place, like the EPA, for example, and the FDA, et cetera, who carefully track that with scientific evidence. And like you couldn't put anything in Coca-Cola that hadn't been tested to the point of view that we know that even at 10 times the dose, it's not causing problems. That's usually the buffer that the FDA requires for anything that's in food. It has to be proven safe at 10 times the dose that any reasonable use of that product will cause somebody to get exposed to before it gets FDA approved. That's basically the standard. So the idea that it causes problems in rats at massive doses doesn't really tell us anything, because rats get cancer. That they do, and if you give them massive doses of pretty much anything, there's a good article that was written not too long, a couple of years ago. I can't remember the author, but it basically says like everything causes cancer. And what they did was they looked at the literature, and what they found was they went through a cookbook. And they just tabulated like the first couple of hundred ingredients in the food, and then they looked at the literature. And for almost every ingredient, you could find a study that showed that it either prevented cancer or it caused cancer. There's pretty much everything. So again, that's the noise in the basic science that we have to then put into context of, well, what's the dose? What's the exposure? What did it is this just an animal study, or is it just in a petri dish? Is it really having an effect in the real world? And when you sort through all the noise, it's like most of this stuff is just below the radar. It's below the level where it's just in the background noise of just exposure to everything in life. So sugar's a more complicated question. We definitely consume more sugar than we should. It definitely correlates with disease like diabetes and tooth decay. So we absolutely should be reducing our average daily intake of simple carbohydrates in our Western society.
Don't worry, this is a problem.
Yeah, no question. Caffeine is a complicated issue that...
Don't take my caffeine away from me, Steve.
It's a personal choice.
Cut you.
It's a personal choice. But all I do is, I don't tell my patients what to do, but you're having 20 migraines a month. If you stopped drinking 120 ounces of coffee a day, that might reduce your migraines. Let's see what happens, And often I've cured patients of their caffeine withdrawal headaches by doing that. But that's an individual thing. I'll just say it that way.
All right. Well, that's a good place to end.
All
Thank
right.
you so much, Steve. We
All right,
appreciate
thank you
your
all.
time.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. We'll see you later.